Back in July of 2022, Ukraine's officials said they managed to swell their military and paramilitary forces to 1 million troops. Since then, 2 years later, the numbers haven't changed a lot. Yet in February of this year, a bombshell claim surfaced from the office of Ukraine's president. They ordered an audit to find out why only 300,000 soldiers participated in combat so far. That's likely out of more than a million, as the overall mobilized figure has risen since. This video can't do an audit of the troops, of course, but it can explain how military troop numbers work and why the 300,000 figure isn't necessarily so strange. Nevertheless, it will explain how such a troop figure is becoming a serious problem, as continued Russian advances are clearly showing. Ukraine's military rose in size quickly during 2022, from a few 100,000 in February to 700,000 in July. On top of that, paramilitary formations and National Guard added almost 300,000 more personnel. Since then, news of further numbers were scant. At one point near the end of 2023, there came mention of 800,000 mobilized for the military, including the territorial defense forces, and a total of 1.1 million when including the paramilitary and the police. In a January 2024 interview, Zelensky said that Ukrainian military had 880,000 troops. It was not clear if said figure was military combined with the paramilitary organizations, though given its size and other sources' estimates, it's likely said number includes the territorial army, perhaps even the National Guard, but likely not the National Police or the Border Guards. A month earlier though, Zelensky also mentioned at one point that Ukraine's ground forces numbered 600,000 across all branches. No further details were given, but given that wording he might have been talking about the army and the National Guard, which is another parallel fighting formation which does sometimes participate in actual combat. But he was not necessarily talking about the border guards, and certainly not about the Air Force, Air Defense, Navy, Central Command, and so on. Here's what one of the more respected publications, International Institute for Strategic Studies Military Balance 2024, said of Ukraine's military composition, circa end of 2023. Of course, the actual distribution is likely a bit different, possibly like our previously given estimate. Of those figures, the army is of course by default a ground force. So are the airborne forces, which in Ukraine's military simply represent a separate, more elite organization of ground forces. Special forces are also ground forces by nature. Ukraine's navy actually doesn't have a meaningful number of large ships anymore, but 20,000 personnel here is not strange. It accounts for guard personnel monitoring the coast. Not just missile batteries and sensor units, but literally guard units securing important coastal locations. The Air Force's 37,000 personnel is again not a surprising figure. While Ukraine has only dozens of working combat planes and probably not more than dozens of various support planes and helicopters, the vast air defense network is under the Air Force's command. A single Patriot battery requires 90 soldiers directly, but with logistics troops that figure rises to 150. There are dozens of various SAM batteries in Ukraine, plus a network of early warning radars, command and relay nodes, and the logistics network. There could easily be 20,000 troops just in the radar and SAM defense network. All those don't really include the short-range SAMs, as those are part of the army, so their personnel count should be part of the army figure. If some of those numbers given so far do not make sense, one has to keep in mind that after almost 2.5 years of war, Ukraine too lost troops. Exactly how many, that's of course hard to say. The Russian military claimed over 400,000 wounded or killed Ukrainians by February 2024. Of course, they would have vested interest in not being truthful, just like Ukraine's own claim of just 31,000 dead, made around the same time. Ukraine doesn't want the morale to drop even further, so it has to obfuscate the numbers. US officials have made off-the-record claims to US media in August 2023. Those figures are a bit out of date, but still, they could be regarded as more neutral. Then there's the UA Losses Initiative. Sadly, one can't vouch for its credibility as its authors are keeping themselves secret. but it claims it tracks local authorities' announcements, relatives of the deceased on social media, gravestones, and so on. Mediazona news organization actually sampled 400 of their random entries and found the UA Losses website to be well researched and their claims to be reliable. UA Losses says it doesn't include missing soldiers and it only lists people where there's evidence of death. They say the actual death count is estimated to be considerably higher. So that may explain the discrepancy between their and US officials' death estimates. At around the time the US officials made their 70,000 killed estimate, the UA Losses project has roughly 34,000 killed listed. So half. If that same ratio somehow held until today, one might estimate what current Ukrainian losses might look like. UA Losses counted evidence for 51,000 killed by 20th of June, so that might suggest some 100,000 killed in total by the same date. Again, using the US officials' dead to wounded ratio of 1.7 wounded for each dead, that suggests some additional 170,000 wounded. That ratio is a bit strange though, as most other estimates during the war suggested there are 2 to 3 wounded for every dead soldier. One plausible explanation is that the US estimate doesn't count the lightly wounded, meaning those that eventually returned to serve again. World War II statistics suggested roughly half of the wounded were so gravely wounded that they did not return to serve. Anyway, it's thus plausible 180 to 270,000 Ukrainians were either killed or gravely wounded during these past 28 months, which would suggest that the military and the paramilitary had some 1.3 million people serving over time. Due to casualties, the current figure of troops actually serving in Ukraine may be closer to 1 or 1.1 million. That actually meshes well with Zelensky's January 2024 claim of 880,000 troops in the military, if those include the National Guard. Adding the paramilitaries like the Border Guard and the National Police, which may have risen in numbers slightly since 2022, one can easily get over the 1 million figure. Okay, but how does that explain the claim of only 300,000 troops in combat? Well, the claim is obviously a little bit out of context. It doesn't seem to take into account the people that died or were wounded gravely enough so they are not serving anymore. Otherwise, there would be closer to just 100,000 people with combat experience, which is clearly not the case. Also, every organization needs support. For every brigade that's on the front line, there is just as many people in other army formations supporting that brigade. The logistics units, the command units, and various other indirect support units. The active duty US Army, for example, has some 32 brigade combat teams. Those should tally some 141,000 troops, but the US active duty Army has 452,000 troops, meaning over 300,000 more personnel is supporting those 140,000 frontline troops, be it via artillery firepower, aviation, logistics, engineering, medical support, command and communications, and so on. Future generations of soldiers also need to be trained, so training camps are also in that tally. But the active-duty US Army is perhaps too support-heavy to be compared with Ukraine's army. So let's look at the US Army National Guard, which isn't as heavily equipped and doesn't need as much support or overhead personnel as the active-duty army. It has further 27 frontline brigades, enough for some 119,000 troops. It adds little over 200,000 more troops to support them, yielding a somewhat smaller support to frontline brigade ratio. Or we could look at the German military, because it's one of the rare militaries which is divided into far more than just 3 main branches. Their command and support branches are separated, which is very handy for this comparison. And it shows just how many moving parts a military has to support that one soldier at the front. So for the 8 brigades worth of frontline troops, or roughly 38,000 troops, there are still some 24,000 additional troops providing artillery firepower, immediate supplies, aviation, and so on. And on top of those, some 60% of other organizations' personnel are there to support the army numbers. Basically, if it was like the US organization, the German army would number some 110,000 troops, yielding a very similar 2-to-1 ratio of direct combat troops and support troops. After all that, let's get back to Ukraine's army. If it indeed has some 600,000 ground troops in all services, as Zelensky said back in December 2023, it's no wonder that only half have seen combat. That would be a ratio of 1-to-1. Compared to US and German armies, that ratio suggests far more Ukrainian troops saw combat compared to what their role should be. Again, that's not so strange when one knows that Ukraine is fighting a war. It has a lot of infantry units monitoring a long front line. Said infantry is also largely static, and as Ukraine lacks aviation and even vehicles to the same ratios as the Navy armies have, it's understandable that there's less support needed for those Ukrainian frontline troops. Hence the 1-to-1 ratio is actually achievable. So it's likely Ukraine does have some 300,000 ground troops right at the front, with another 300,000 troops providing support of all kinds to those fighting. Then there are other branches of the military, the non-ground troops. Those seem to number some 60,000. So how do we get from there to 880,000? Those almost 300,000 more troops are Territorial Army and the National Guard troops. While some of them are part of the 300,000 with experience, not all are. Many such units are likely manning those border areas where there is no fighting, like Belarus, northeast of Kharkiv, and Transnistria. Even more crucially, they're monitoring numerous facilities all across Ukraine, because a war like this inevitably opens up Ukraine to all sorts of spies, divergent activity, and so on. Ukraine is a big country. There are thousands of locations for power, gas, fuel, and water distribution, warehouses, depots, railways, junctions, and even every mile of railway and important roads to be monitored, on top of factories, training centers, and a myriad of other obvious military targets. Of course, of those almost 300,000 troops, only half might be in the field, as those too need supply and support, administration, and so on, like any military in the world. Some of those non-frontline troops might be, for instance, tasked with training a bunch more troops, or there might simply be corruption involved, in the sense that as the morale in the military dropped, some people within the military found ways to hide from the front line doing some administrative work. That's plausibly a small part of the issue, but not the main reason why just 300,000 troops have seen combat. The main reason for that, as we said, is simply the nature of organization of a military. You can't escape having a lot of non-combat personnel for every combatant. If Ukraine simply pushed 600,000 troops to the front line, those would lack equipment, they would lack support, and their formations would be largely ineffective. So why does Ukraine really need more than 300,000 troops deployed at the front line? Simply because Russia deployed more, and because Russia seems to be steadily advancing, even if slowly. Ukraine has roughly 110 brigades in its order of battle. The Territorial Defense Army has a fair chunk of those, around 30. While the Army, the Airborne Troops, the National Guard, and others have around 80. One of those is the single brigade manned by policemen. The rest of the 100k strong police force is of course needed to actually police the country. But a small number of all those brigades are actually paper brigades, not yet manned, and a fair chunk, possibly over half, are undermanned. Losses are not easily and quickly replaced, and fresh recruits are not trickling in high enough numbers. That's one explanation why the total frontline troop count isn't over 450,000 troops, as it should be given the number of brigades, but it is closer to 300,000. Another explanation is that the 300,000 figure bemoaned about simply does not include units which have not seen fighting and don't have combat experience. Certainly with the Belarus border and the Transnistria border, with the coastline being guarded, there should be many units out there which were lucky enough not to see fighting yet. Transnistria is often forgotten. Technically it's part of Moldova, but it's de facto independent and influenced by Russia. Russia has 1,500 troops there in addition to Transnistrian paramilitary. Its border with Ukraine is roughly 250 kilometers long. That's in addition to the 900-kilometer border with Belarus, which hasn't seen fighting in over 2 years, but which still needs to be manned. Anyway, Russia has roughly 130 brigades worth of units deployed in Ukraine, though again quite a few are likely not fully manned due to constant new losses. In late 2023, Putin said 617,000 Russian troops were in what he called a special operation zone. But even if that figure was true, that zone likely includes border areas as well, and it definitely should include some support units, not just frontline brigades. It should not be confused with Ukrainian claims of Russian troop numbers. Around the same time, in October 2023, Ukraine's officials mentioned that some 400,000 Russian troops were deployed in Ukrainian territory. Those figures too likely included various support units, but they explicitly stated the number of troops inside pre-war Ukraine's borders. Since then, however, those numbers have risen. In December 2023, Ukrainian military officials said 450,000 Russian troops were deployed inside Ukraine. And fairly recently, in May 2024, the Royal United Services Institute mentioned Russia was using 510,000 troops attacking Ukraine. Again, it's not fully clear if all those represent actual maneuver brigades, but it can't be far off. And the material advantage due to half a year of no aid from the US, as well as slowly building numerical advantage, has been showing on the front line in recent months. It's only in the last few weeks that Russian advances slowed down a bit as NATO aid finally started reaching Ukraine in greater quantities. But even so, Russia is still progressing slowly. That's why those 300,000 Ukrainian troops at the front line do need to increase. That's why the new mobilization wave is important for Ukraine. And that's why without fresh troops in a fairly short time frame, Russian advance, however slow it is, may not be stopped. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.